This was the reason why we actually established the Australian LCI database to allow companies to demonstrate they're better than the generic one. I know because I started the Australian LCI database with the group of people from RMIT and CSIRO back in the day. And now we pass it on to ALCAS to manage. And so some of the people who are doing EPDs, if they don't have the basic information, they would still draw from that to fill in their background, for example. So we have a base. So then it's just a matter of making it worthwhile for individual products. The other problem is for the same reason that the market's small, is because even if they are able to produce an EPD, they cannot update it as frequent, for example, as the European-based companies, like every 2 or 3 years, when things have gotten better in their production, for example, in their technology, and lower their embodied carbon. Some companies will think, we've done the EPD, we're done. But that's not the case, right?
And so perhaps
yes,
to fill the gap, so you are asking for the driving forces. Yes, so from my point of view, there are 3. First, the self-commitment of a company, trying to become a front runner, trying to show the environmental advantageousness of their production processes.
They're better than the average.
Yes. The second driving forces are legal binding requirements. This we will see in Europe soon, based on construction product regulation. You have to show declaration of performance, including all the environmental impacts, to bring your product to the market. And you must have, in future, digital product passport, including all such data. And driving force number 3 is the forces of the free market or a powerful national government with free public procurement. You can tell the industry, if your product is not able to provide us with data we need, we will not use your product. This is a powerful position. Now you can select which strategy you like to follow.
We had a question from the chat from Mike Dodd from the Australian Building Codes Board, which is the organization that puts together the National Construction Code here. Is for you, Maria. The question is, if you have seen actual changes to the way buildings are designed, so not just of lower carbon materials, but have you seen, different ways of designing buildings, dematerialization, like changes to actual design? In Denmark, since the embodied carbon requirements, the limits came.
Maybe I would have Harper. Because I haven't been in Denmark for such a long time, so to really observe the differences.
Was there a change in design over the years?
Over the design of the buildings?
Yeah, like people designing buildings differently now than
we haven't really, we haven't really been questioning from like having DGNB from 2012, and if what has the impacts really gotten lower. I think that has been quite difficult for us to measure because the way we have been calculating has also been evolving over the time. But I think now we got the legal legislation from requirement from 2023, and I think we can be able to measure it very soon, but not yet because the building cases they evolve over a longer time, so we don't have the proof yet. But what I can see now, at least in some part of the building sector, or building the designers and so on, there's a huge changes happening. I think it's only, unfortunately, in a small part, but where they're really figuring out solutions where you can see that we can more than half our emissions from buildings. So we are really seeing changes in some part of the industry, but we don't know how much, how long time it will take out for, adapt over the whole industry.
No, and I think that's, it's only been around the limits for just over years. It's also early, but I think is that what Mike is coming from is that is incredibly valuable because the impact of life cycle at scale has been something very theoretical because we haven't really done it at this scale in the way we've been doing it in the last couple of years. And so a lot of that experience is also going to tell us how do we refine, where do we simplify these mechanisms, where do we need to go deeper, And so you will be invited to even more conferences that you have in Australia already.
Yeah. But if I can just add for the DGNB certification also, they have been like, that covers really many things, so LCA is only a part of it. So maybe there has been a little bit too much focus on getting the gold certificate without really looking into what you are improving. And also that, also because they have been like developing the method, so things have been, more focused on getting experience with making the LCA for the first 10 years, I think.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
Thomas?
So 2 examples. First one for Denmark. In Denmark, there's a famous company producing windows in the roofs. And there's an ongoing debate. Perhaps we can reduce the glass in the window from 3 to 2 or from 4 to 3 to save some glass, also to save some embodied carbon. And on building level, especially in Germany, there's an ongoing debate how to optimize load-bearing structure. You know, in the past, it was always to resist, to resist to earthquakes, to loads, and so on. And nowadays, the specialized engineers, they come already out with catalog, and you can see the load-bearing structure in different options. And one of the parameters is now embodied carbon. And there's an ongoing debate now, if you have a new building, there's an ongoing debate, you really need an underground car park or not, because there are so many embodied carbon in an underground car park. But you know, now, and I mentioned this already this morning, there are so many target conflicts. And now you say, let us avoid the underground car park. Yes, but where we bring the cars, so we need more space. And again, it's too complicated to reduce the overall discussion just to embodied carbon. We have also to take into account all the other indicators like land use, indoor air quality, and things like this.
So I
There's one
promised,
question more in the machine, I think.
I promised Meredith that I was going to chair this properly and finish on time. So I have one last question just to close this off, and to all our panel members. We had and I apologize, there's a couple of questions on the chat that we're going to take offline as well. But there's one thing that struck me about a lot of the presentations from earlier today is that the road for countries like the Netherlands and France and Denmark and others who've actually established limits and are in practice already, it's been long. They've been working on that. Some policies go back to like 10, 12 years ago, like it seeds from that. And one thing that I was reflecting on is countries like Australia, it's been much more recent. We've been doing lots of work in the last, lots of people for a long time in terms of policymakers. We've been only engaging with this since 2020, really, if we're honest, right? And so my question to you is, we have to, if embodied carbon is so important to decarbonize industry, for example, we can't wait for countries that are just starting now to have a ramp up of 15 or 20 years before beginning to introduce this requirement. So my question is, how do we actually use the experience from countries that have been leading, but it took a long time and a lot of investment to get there, for other countries to be able to follow much faster? So embodied carbon can make this really big difference in decarbonizing the building sector and the industrial sector in the very short amount of time that we have to do so. Susanna, I'm going to start with you.
From the policy perspective, I think organisations like this one, Annex 89, the work of the RNDBI, MECLA, the work that we do quite often with our international colleagues, just talking to them about how we've made progress, who we built our progress from. So we can say that, Australia is looking good at the moment because it's slightly ahead of where the UK is. But the reality is that the industry in the UK have been lobbying the government for a long time and have some quite sophisticated information out there that was really, really helpful for us when we were looking at policy options. So I wouldn't say we've completely leapfrogged them. That's not really how history works. But continuing the conversation, answering their questions and kind of telling them, where we went wrong. When did policymakers not listen to us? When did they say you need much better information and evidence here before we do anything? All of that is really important from a policy perspective.
Maria?
Yeah. I think also, at least in the case of Denmark, lots of the pressure to also tighten the limit values at this level at the moment comes from the industry itself. So the industry also has the desire to be front runners in the region and in Europe. So in a way, we have built the competencies, so it's very important also for the sector to have the skill, calculate the climate impacts, and then also the acceptability of the limit values and then declarations is increasing. So it's also becoming easier to implement such regulations.
Amazing. Thomas, bring us home.
So in a certain way, the main idea is, if you like to save time, to overtake some knowledge and experiences. So Annex 72 is offering for free hundreds of pages explaining all the details, also how to create a national database. You can take this as a starting point for sure. You can take this as an option for peaceful collaboration around the world, a very important argument, by the way. And because I'm an older gentleman, I would recommend to you read all the older books. By the way, I have finished my PhD in 1985 dealing with embodied energy. And also there was a, let us say, database with embodied energy for all the materials. Also in my former eastern part of Germany, under communist pressure, we have done this already. And if you go back in history, you will find books in 1921. There was a requirement by government, there was a ministry in Berlin in 1921. In our days, we would call it Ministry for Sustainable Development. It was, let us say, Happy Society Ministry or something like this, 1921. And you will find books, left-hand side, how much coal is needed to heat the house, and right-hand side, how much coal was necessary to produce construction products. 100 years embodied coal. So what is our problem? Haber was telling us this morning, we are moving slow since 100 years. And we become older and older, and we are waiting, and we become more and more angry or over-motivated. You can see this in my person. But now you can understand why. We are waiting in a certain way since 100 years to make it real. The data are there since 100 years. And now we need the willingness to act in a certain way.
Love it. Greg, would you like to have the last word? We're doing
Yes, it's because the question is excellent. Yeah? And it's based on the Danish thing, right? 12 years. But the thing is, I think you can see that the leg is shortening. So there was 150 years in Germany, and then he came along, right? And so on. So, but it's different now because one of the studies we did and we presented earlier was the number of papers and research that take into account embodied carbon. 20 years ago, we're just a few of us doing embodied carbon research. Since the Paris Agreement, the treaty in 2015, there was an explosion of embodied and whole life carbon papers. At the same time, when Annex 57 started in 2011, at the start of the Danish work, there was a long pause of nothing. And then we got together, and so then there's a lot of effort coming out while they were developing theirs. And it was happening in parallel. So what I'm saying is, it doesn't have to take 12 years anymore. It can be 3, it can be 4. And the next round will be 2, and so on. The only caveat is the socialization, which you cannot, there's a limit by which you can crunch it. But the technical information I gave to neighbors before, all the Annex 72 papers and so on and so forth. A lot of the base information are there, so it's now how to socialize it. So the earlier you can put it on the ground and allow that socialization, the faster it can be. There's no more excuse.
Yeah, it's a great point, Greg, and maybe just to demonstrate that example. 3 or 4 years ago, there were basically 0 public servants actually working on embodied carbon in Australia, I think, unless I'm mistaken. And 3 or 4 years later, we have a national standard that's going to be launched tomorrow. Based on a lot of the experiences, it borrows a lot from Denmark, but a lot of the experiences from recent years, from what our colleagues in New Zealand did, very harmonized with New Zealand, because we're kind of like a regional little power and we share a lot of things together. And we're in a position where we could do that in 3 years because of all the work that's been done in other countries for the last decade or 2. I'm going to stop it there. Meredith, I was 5 or 10 minutes late anyway. My apologies. And I'll just throw it back to you.
Thank you.
Thank you to our panelists.
Thank you so much. So I'm going to share just a few thoughts that come to me based on what today's discussion means for our research priorities and next steps before Stanford closes us out. And first, I'd just like to say thank you to all of you. I found this discussion really enriching and just really appreciate the fact that we could get together and talk. I've learned so much today. Wow, in terms of future research directions, there are a lot, right? But I would condense it into three. I wish I had a white bone, I do, but you wouldn't want my handwriting. So on the one hand, we heard a lot about the need for taking a more holistic perspective, whether that means factoring in more issues when we're looking at resilience or looking at embodied carbon from more different perspectives, trying to factor in more of the emissions, but also issues like what that does to small business that Suzanne raised. So standing back and trying to take a more holistic perspective. And on the other hand, making sure everything is practical, right? Providing practical information that may be simplified. We can't have the same kind of complex metrics that we're using from a research perspective that can be used for public policy, let's say. Or on embodied carbon, the whole discussion about just how detailed should this be? How do we make sure it's doable in reality, right? And then to me, those two come together around the areas of data and transparency. And so it strikes me that there's a lot of work that this working group could do around that issue of data and transparency and just bringing together, resilience metrics. What is actually working in practice in the field? What's the experience with early adopters, be they Denmark or Australia or the UK? And what are we learning about not just overheating, which has been practiced more, let's say, in building energy codes, but some of the other climate impacts that affect energy systems. So, cold snaps without electricity or wildfires. What are we learning also about incorporating future climate data? Our ability to understand the CMIP6 data set or the forthcoming CMIP7 data set and what that means about extremes, it's evolving. Our tools and our ability to understand that, but that complexity, we also have to find ways to simplify that. What does that mean for our future data in that space? And similarly, for understanding different building types, different climate zones, are there ways that we can have more standardized models for that we could share across countries, or just even frameworks for thinking about it so that we're reducing some of that complexity and allowing countries to possibly leapfrog? And then similarly on embodied carbon, that idea of interoperability, of free, of transparent, of ensuring that we're covering not just, the greatest hits, let's say, of steel and cement and glass, but digging deeper and looking at more of the emissions, looking at, more of the scope 3 emissions, looking at emissions that may in the future be associated with LULUCF, as Thomas mentioned. I mean, the challenge of that, because we don't necessarily have an extremely clear understanding of the land use emissions at any given point on the planet, right? Our ability to assess that is not unlimited today. So how do we take that very complex topic and make it simple enough that you could actually have policy built around it, that's practical at the local level, that companies, that designers, that construction companies can work with, and thinking through the practicality of it so that pull from holistic to the practical, I think presents a really important challenge for us from a research perspective, and I think it's really fertile ground. And on the topics that we discussed at the top of this meeting, I think that kind of a framework could be really helpful in thinking through how we digest any given topic that we're looking at, with, of course, the background behind of data and transparency. So yeah, with that, I'd like to again thank everybody, and especially our presenters, who were online at very late hours.
please, the one
And
for.
I apologize, I'd like to also thank our hosts, the Australian government and the University of Melbourne. I did not say that before to Greg and Stanford, Felicity, Nat, you've just done an amazing job. Thanks.
Good. Now, this clicker seems to be empty. Great. Thank you very much. Good, thank you. Good. So we've covered quite a bit of ground quite intensely this afternoon. So thank you, everyone. It's been really useful discussion, at least for me, learning a lot and trying to apply sort of some of this, some of the robust discussion we've had about a lot of different attributes and features which have been brought up about resilience and embodied carbon in particular, which have really made me think, oh, this isn't as simple as I thought. This is much more complex. Now we've got to operationalise this in some way and turn this into something which looks as though it is a code which can be applied by someone who's learned something, who's learned how to build, and it needs to change how they needs to change their construction practice. And thinking, look, how do we turn all this complexity into something which can be translated into black letter law and then translated into real change in people's behaviours? Having raised the question, I can say I have to think about it a lot more because it really is a big challenge. It's quite a big process. But I want to say thank you to all our experts who have been really inputting into this process and sort of raising these things, because it's very easy to do things very quickly and then and then you end up repenting later and having to fix things up. So it's really useful. So we've got the plan. We covered the planned activities and the 2-year work plan and a little bit about the new sign-ups, and I appreciate that there's quite a lot of thought and gone into some of those suggestions which we talked about earlier. Encourage people to reflect upon how different nations, because this is about nations cooperating, how different nations can contribute to sharing experience in this space. It makes it easier for all the rest of us. And I can certainly reflect that we've learned a lot as Australia. We've learned a lot, particularly from Northern Europe, about the experience with embodied carbon, and it's been an inspiration. As a result, we're doing things much faster, which is good. And in the area of resilience, there's a lot of work which is sort of cutting across and sort of, let's just say it's a big pie. There's a small slice which is relevant to our work, but there's quite a lot else going on in this space, and trying to define sort of what our role is for bringing energy codes in this is actually quite complex. Okay, well, having said that, I'm standing between you and free drinks, so I want to.
It's finishing soon. It's finishing soon.
And finishing soon. So please join us for refreshments at Melbourne Connect. As you can see, it's 700 Swanson Street. Greg, do you know where that is?
Yes, of course, that's my office. So
That's your office.
If you like some drinks, hopefully there's some more there.
Follow Greg, and there's free drinks until 6:30, I understand, so don't dawdle. And tomorrow morning, as you can see, there's both the DBI conference continued. There's also the Buildings Energy Performance Summit at Ridges, Melbourne, and that's the address up there. So thank you. Greg, lead the way.
Yeah.